everyone. Hello, still with us? Thanks for being here. So when we thought of, when we were invited by Cindy to talk about something, we thought it would be really important, and we work as a team as well, to discuss something that we are actually in the middle of discussing even with our students in our classrooms on a daily basis, the issue of knife crime and the problem that it has generated. So I just want to start as a criminologist and a sociologist, what conversations are we having? But also, it's not limited to the talk of the criminologist or sociologist when it comes to a huge social problem such as knife crime and its human impact, the human cost of knife crime. So we decided we should engage in a bigger discussion on this, and I'd invite you also to reflect with us on some of the themes that we present today. So news headlines are becoming quite predictable. We are in the middle of crime epidemic, or are we, actually? So when was the last time when you opened a newspaper or you heard the TV, radio news about yet another stabbing incident? And I'm pretty sure that wasn't too long ago. Speaking of predictable headlines, Hugh Muir, who writes for The Guardian, he wrote something like this, and you can almost picture it and imagine it, because I certainly did when I was reading it. It can't be said that covering terrorist attacks is easy, but to a degree, it is at least straightforward. The gun is fired, the knife is wielded, the bomb goes off, and we dispatch our brightest and best. They go to the scene, find out what happened, talk to those in range, file their stories. In the days that pass, we mourn the dead, assess the claim of responsibility, praise the first responders. The world moves on. But what happens when the horror comes in installments, he asks, when there is no one scene of the crime, no claim of responsibility, no immediate and dastardly logic? And I think he raises a really important question for all of us. So as a criminologist and sociologist, Carole and I would like to join up the conversation between the cause and the effect of knife crime. I will start with the analysis of knife crime, presenting the what, covering legislation and policy in place to control knife crime. In presenting a social analysis, Carole will cover why and question media constructions and public perceptions about knife crime as well, and hopefully deconstruct them. We argue together that current concerns about knife crime, and indeed gangs, are not new. In the noughties, in the 90s, or much further back, even in Victorian England, the situation was quite similar. Back then, as now, there is discussion about young people involved as victims and perpetrators, rising levels of knife crime in urban areas, feral youth, and urgent calls for decisive government action. I would also suggest that key facts about knife crime and why people carry knives sits at odds with policy and also media constructions, and indeed our own perception of knife crime. So we need to do some challenging here too. So looking at these slides, moral panics. We are desperate, we are vexed, we are perplexed, we are frustrated, we have simply quite had enough. But moral panics over crime levels are pretty common. They occur when specific types of crime are perceived as being threatening. As the media sound bites and headlines about knife crime, gangs, acid attacks, morbid crime emerge, the threat seems and begins to feel real. This is also in part due to the introduction of new government legislation or new strategies of government or even new policing tactics. The most recent, of course, being the Offensive Weapons Act, which was just passed by Parliament in May, and the much reported and discussed knife crime prevention orders, and a bit more on that later. I expect most of us saw this grim headline on the BBC news pages recently. Yes? Yeah? You remember seeing this? Yes, this year also brings a new law. It was reported that these were the first 100 victims of homicide, 40 of whom were stabbed, while others were killed by other means. The age range of victims is also strikingly wide, but it's a commonly held belief that it is young people. In fact, most of the data suggests otherwise. There are, of course, young people involved, both as perpetrators and victims, but indeed the data will suggest that the age is a little bit higher. They're young adults and in their 24 to 30 onwards. A fifth of those killed this year were under the age of 20, but most commonly victims were in their 20s, late 20s and 30s. As Judith Rowbottom's research on crime news demonstrates, how crime actually strikes a chord with the public because they apparently confirm our own existing anxieties. For example, the idea that knife crime is on the rise is actually grist to the mill for those who argue that there aren't enough police on our streets. This is how a moral panic is created and escalated. Reporting proves that a community is right to be worried, and indeed we are. The reality is that sober and solid research often shows very little real change in crime levels, as desperate and as tragic all this is. So knife crime, do the police really know about how much there really is? And that's the question. To some extent, yes, they have access to data that they collect. We report the crime, they record it, they investigate it, and we see that in the published figures. But there's a lot more to that, to those figures. They also come in from our accident and emergency departments. The National Health Service is also collating its own data. Some of these reports are not even reported to police. Victims who do not go ahead and make a complaint to the police. And there have been different ways in which knife crime is also reported. There is a variance across police force areas in England and Wales. How it is recorded, how it is analysed, and in what way is the data cut and sliced in order to present the picture that the person, the analyst, or the policymaker, or indeed the chief constable wants to present. And indeed, let's not forget the politicians as well. So there's no time to go into this range of issues that there are, but there is a lot of variance in how the data gets published and also reported also by news reporters. And here is another thing. Also, although police recorded crime data shows a continued but smaller rise in certain types of offenses involving knives or sharp instruments, over the last year, police figures indicated rises in some higher harm, violent offenses involving the use of weapons. Now, many people think about, when we talk about weapons and sharp instruments, we immediately think about knives. But there are other recording practices too that would include other sharp instruments, screwdrivers, also broken glass as sharp instruments that cause death and indeed injury. And so recorded offenses involving knives or sharp instruments went up by 6% to almost 40,000, more than 40,000 in this last year. And this is actually consistent with an increasing trend over the last few years. However, the rate of increase has been getting smaller. And in the year ending June 2018, it is slightly smaller. It's 9% compared to the previous year. So there's so much manipulation of the data that goes on in reporting knife crime as well. But where do we get all of the powers to deal with the issues of knife crime? And I think this is an interesting issue for us to deal with as well. For instance, there's a whole plethora of legislation that follows, of course, with several intricate policies and procedures for operational purposes. So to start with, you have Prevention of Crime Act 1953, Restrictions of Offensive Weapons Act of 1959, the Criminal Justice Act of 1988, Knives Act of 1997, and the most recent Offensive Weapons Act of 2019. And this is not to mention some of these other offenses through which police also get powers. For example, the Modern Slavery Act of 2015, but also the Police and Criminal Evidence Act as well. So there's a whole host of legislation in place empowering our agencies, empowering police, but more and more councils, local government, as well as school, within school premises as well. So there is, the approach, it seems, is rather putting together a whole host. Our responses almost are knee-jerk, rather than holistic, drawing together pieces of legislation. And all of this already exists in legislation, but somehow we are very poor at implementing in practice. So, for instance, all of this exists, but the efficiency of a knife, so here is responding to our fears about knife crime, and this is not to underestimate or downplay the significance of any death that has occurred or any injury that indeed has occurred as a result of using a knife. It is simply to say that looking at the data, and that is why history is so important, and we have to draw on history to take our lesson. Why stop? So most crime reports that are giving us news about knife crime go only in the last 5 to 6 years or maximum 10 years. But we really need to, and this is from the Office of National Statistics, we really need to take a long-term view if we indeed are going to understand, what is the problem of knife crime and what indeed are we to do as a society to address it. So the efficiency of a knife as a killing instrument hasn't actually increased in 40 years. It's still being used almost at similar rates. So there hasn't been. So this panic is indeed quite questionable, because in terms of, as you can see, the other homicides, which are reported on the dark green graph bar, and just below it using a sharp instrument, that has almost, with a little degree of variation, has remained quite constant. And that really brings us to question how we report some of these things, how we do drum up the moral panic within society. And that causes and calls for tougher sentences because they are certainly on the increase. And in the last decade, we certainly have seen a disproportionate number of young people being committed to very long sentences. So this brings us to question really about what are we going to do? Is this how we want to continue? And these are often some very difficult conversations that we have. Are there other approaches? So as criminologists, we might just look at the data, go out and do some research, talk to people, policymakers, and campaign for bringing about the right kind of change. But more on the right kind of change, I will hand over to Carole. Thank you.
Thank you, Neena. Okay, so moving on. I just want to kind of summarise some of the key points on this slide. I don't want to read it out to you, but just to say to some extent, and this is from Hansard in 2019, to some extent we have become inured to the violence on our streets. It is certainly happening across East London, but it's also happening elsewhere in the country. Every week there seem to be more news stories about stabbings, gun crime and related activities, as Neena has just said. But the point that John Cryer makes is that there have been profound shifts in society and profound changes in the way in which society is structured and how people live. A lot of these profound changes underlie what we have seen over the past few months or the past year. Structures that used to provide security and safety, particularly for children, have been undermined and in some cases have completely disappeared. Now, I haven't got time to go into what those structures are, but I think it was very interesting in Richard Solomon's presentation, some of the issues that he raised within that could be used to kind of underpin some of these arguments. So everyone has an explanation for the latest increase in violence, from public spending cuts, which have led to the closing of around 100 youth clubs across particularly London. You might have heard of some of these. Reduced mental health services, reduced police funding, to new forms of drug dealing, including county lines, which comes under the umbrella of modern slavery, increasingly reliant on young people to carry this out, as well as the impact of social media, drill music and London's fractious inequalities. But how is this represented in the media, and what does the evidence show? So here you'll see some examples from the media, and you see the way in which the kind of language that's used helps to create this moral panic around knife crime, which, as Neena has illustrated, is actually not based on evidence or fact. So you see here crime count, bloodiest, the use of this kind of word, knife thugs, jihadis, what is the kind of purpose of using this language in media coverage? And here you see more examples. When will it stop? Calling the army. You know, some really kind of overblown and obviously moral panic solutions to the problems that are proposed. I mean, calling in the army for knife crime, when actually what Neena has shown is that hasn't increased over the past 30 or 40 years. So that's problematic, really. And some more, and it goes on and on and on. Any kind of research on the internet, on Google Images, you will be easily able to find these media stories. But what are the actual facts and figures? Oh, sorry, I forgot about Trump. We realised that we couldn't go because obviously Trump's visit here. This is the latest. He said that British hospitals are a sea of blood. I find that really interesting, especially when I've written about the Rivers of Blood speech previously in relation to how that's been taken up by media. And it's interesting that Trump has chosen this kind of language when speaking about London. Okay. So we've kind of identified the problem in terms of media discourses, but what do we know about the issue itself? And what are the kind of solutions? So one of the solutions that's being proposed is this kind of public health approach to tackling knife crime. Now, why is this being approached? Because some of the statistics show, and this is evidence from a major trauma centre in London, that a significant majority, 71% of the patients under 25 who were treated for stab injuries came from the most deprived 20% of London neighbourhoods. Only 1% came from the least deprived 20% of neighbourhoods. Earlier Scottish research showed similar results. Deprivation, it is widely agreed, is a major predictor of serious youth violence. And yet, as Neena has shown, broader societal factors are often not taken account of when discussing youth violence and knife crime. The public health approach, though, what does it mean? So, politicians, including Labour MP Sarah Jones, who's chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Knife Crime, and Diane Abbott, both speaking on Radio 4's Today programme recently, have both suggested that London needs to adopt a public health approach to reducing knife crime, which means, for example, engaging in major intervention work with youth workers, changing social norms, educating young people, going into schools to speak to people, working with mental health charities. So all the issues that were identified earlier in terms of social deprivation, the idea of the public health discourse is to intervene to change society and change the way in which young people are dealt with. Both of these kind of approaches, or they point to case studies in New York and Glasgow, which is why I mentioned Scotland, where interventions have been adopted with both seeing significant reductions in violent crime, while at the same time also having a lighter touch approach to stop and search. So, analysis from 1,000 police case files in Scotland over a 10-year period show the impact of this model, in which serious assault and attempted murder cases fell by 35% between 2008 and 2018. The study said that 89% of that drop was due to fewer cases, particularly in and around Glasgow, where there was a particular problem, which saw a drop from 1,872 attempted murders and serious assaults to 904 in 2008 to 2009 to 914 in 2017-18. Now, the Scottish Government claim that this was partly due to this public health approach and a campaign that said, no knives, better lives. Now, is it as simplistic as that? Is that going to make a difference if you see a campaign, no knives, better lives? That remains to be seen. But of course, there has been a strategy, the Violence Reduction Unit here in London, supported by Sadiq Khan, and also mirroring what's happened in Scotland, aims to introduce strategies to reduce violence through dealing with tackling things like alcohol use, poverty, social isolation, and exclusion. And these are the big issues that are needed to be tackled, according to Will Linden of Scotland's Violence Reduction Unit, in order to carry on with this reduction in the crime. However, there is a risk that the term public health model is being used without a proper understanding of what is actually required to effect lasting change. And of course, there are other issues with this, aren't there? Because change is required not just in terms of understanding what the model is, but also by law enforcement approaches and politicians, from one of labelling, stigmatisation of certain groups in society and punitive measures, to one of community involvement, building of trust, and funding of initiatives. And in some cases, there is a kind of concern that the language of public health is being used to justify more of the same punitive measures associated with racial profiling and control. It will be some time, though, before the proposed public health responses will bear fruit. In the meantime, critical attention, according to Mason from the Centre for Crime and Justice Studies, critical attention to the emerging disjuncture between public health discourses and the actions proposed to be taken by local authorities, law enforcement, etc., will be necessary if the mistakes of the past are to be avoided. As Neena rightly said, this is not a new issue. So how do we avoid the mistakes of the past in terms of dealing with this? And the benefits of a public health model are to be achieved. We need to look at the past and learn lessons. And I'll finish there. Thank you.